I've been going to this camp since I was 6. Once I'd aged out, I returned as a junior counselor. Now, I'm finally a senior counselor, and I've been one for about 5 years already. In all my years at camp, I've had my fair share of laughs and screams, and even gotten myself in and out of trouble more than I can recall. Now, it was my turn to tell the legends and lore of the camp and terrify new generations of campers. The only downer, though, is that with the technological boom of late Gen Z, these kids don't scare as easily as we used to. They've seen much worse on the internet, and tales of headless axe murderers and tomato farmers serial killers barely even merit a sweaty brow. In my years as a counselor and a camper, I've seen a lot. I don't tend to scare easily, though. Being responsible for a bunch of little kids, not to mention your rowdy trouble magnet friends at times, will give you that false sense of bravado in times of uncertainty and fear. Except, what do you do when the thing you're supposed to be watching over and protecting turns out to be your biggest threat? This is where I have to bring up Molly. I'll call her Molly for privacy's sake. She seemed like a normal kid outwardly, with unruly golden ringlet curls, a button nose, and pale gray eyes. But there was something about her. Whether it be the dark glint in her eye, or the stiff way she carried herself, I cannot be entirely sure. All I know is that I have never seen a child command her parents on where to set up her bunk and how to set it up. Between her haggard mother and father's faces, and her cool, composed expression, it was evident who was in control here. I watched them unload their car quickly as she stood on the porch, clutching a book to her chest, expressionless. I went over to her and squatted beside her, smiling. I regarded my clipboard with the name of the girls in the cabin. "You must be Molly," I exclaimed. "It's so nice to meet you. Is this your first time coming to camp?" Silence. Her lack of response took me aback. Just as I was about to open my mouth and speak again, her father stumped up the stairs with the last of her luggage. He shot her a look I couldn't quite decipher, and they slunk inside. As the rest of the parents unloaded their cars, my eyes fell upon Molly's mother, standing pinned straight in front of the passenger door of their beaten Volkswagen. I waved at her as enthusiastically as I could, trying to shut the rejection I'd just faced out of my mind. She slowly raised her limp hand in a half wave, her blank expression ever the same. She also seemed a bit slack-jawed. I let my hand fall loosely back down to my side, as she slowly let hers fall back down to hers. Her movements were jerky and unnatural. It was unsettling. Never breaking eye contact, I made my way back inside to help the rest of the kids unpack. Admittedly, the first few nights seemed fairly normal. The first couple of nights I had to sleep on a mattress on the floor of the kids' bunk room because they were either scared or they missed their moms, and they begged me to stay with them. I was well acquainted with the floor at this point, because typically every year this happened with the newest campers. By night 3, I was ready to bring up my returning to the counselor's room. They were big girls now, and they were going away to camp, and they needed to be brave. And of course, they could always find me in the next room over if they needed me. A few girls were wary, but most of them had gotten used to cabin life, and were okay with finally toughing it out. By that night, I was back in my normal room with my junior counselor. Leaving the girls unattended was my first major mistake. It was the Thursday of the first week of camp when things began to happen. I was jolted from sleep by ear-splitting shrieks from the room next door. I practically flew from my top bunk with my junior counselor in tow as we beelined it for the girls' room. I burst through the door and found them all cowering together in a circle on the floor, holding each other and crying. Some were too scared to even move or breathe. "What is going on in here, girls?" I cried. "Why were you screaming? What happened?" Between blubbering sobs, one of the girls pointed at the back window where Molly was standing. "Molly scared us. She was scratching at the window from outside." I cocked my eyebrow at the dark, unmoving little figure at the back of the room. The red glow of the exit sign seemed to illuminate her eyes. I squinted at her frail silhouette. She was definitely still inside. There was no back door, no porch, and the cabin was held up by cement blocks. It would have been impossible for her to be peering from the back window. I only told them a little story, came a meek voice from the shadowy mass. What story? I demanded. The story of the 3 headless nuns. I froze. No way. No fucking way. That was the scariest camp story we had. We didn't tell that story to the campers unless they were at least 10. And who the hell had told her? I pushed the wave of questions out of my mind. I spent the next few hours telling the girls that the story wasn't real. Molly sat quietly in her bunk, watching soberly as the traumatized 6-year-olds sobbed in their beds. I desperately tried to comfort them, but in the end, I dragged my mattress and sleeping bag back to my original spot on the floor. From then on, the girls couldn't sleep unless the windows were securely covered, and they absolutely despised Molly. I'm talking full-on shunning and exclusion. I used every counselor trick I had up my sleeve to try and make things better and reconcile with the girls, but none of them were having any of it. Molly was especially disinterested in the others, choosing instead to read her copies of scary stories to tell in the dark over and over again. Over the course of the following weeks, Molly's behavior became increasingly more sinister. She hid crickets and spiders in their beds. She threw their toothbrushes in unflushed toilets. She threw their clothes into bushes and trees as it rained. She would hide under their bunks and made ungodly noises to scare them at night. She jumped on top of them in the lake and pinned them down until I sprinted over and pulled her off. She even slipped in peanuts into one of the girls' bags of trail mix. The same girl who was deathly allergic to peanuts. After the peanut incident, the camp administrators and I decided that enough was enough. She was going to kill someone at this rate. I got on the phone myself and let her parents have it. I recited the ever-growing list of offenses Molly had committed against my other campers and ultimately delivered the news that she was no longer welcome at camp. There was a long pause on the other end before Molly's mother monotonously agreed to come pick her up in the morning. I sighed and looked back at the head counselor, who sat beside me. He groaned and nodded. One more night, and then she'd finally be out of my hair. I wasn't fully confident that my girls would make it through the night alive if I left them alone with Molly, so I again slept on their floor. I'd spent more nights on that floor than in the counselor's room, but what choice did I have? I was awoken by a soft skittering noise. My eyes burst open and I stared at the ceiling, unmoving. A raccoon? No, bigger. It didn't sound far enough away to be on that porch. My stomach lurched at the realization that whatever was making the skittering noise was inside the room with us. I sat up and took a long look around. The girls were all in their beds. At least the girls in the bottom bunks who I could see were. From the ground, I obviously couldn't tell about the top bunks. But these bunk beds were obnoxiously creaky, and I would have noticed if one of them had even moved. I propped myself on my elbow and listened some more. Silence. Sighing deeply, I laid back down on my stomach and flopped onto my pillow. I breathed deeply, watching the back windows nervously. I still cannot fully come to terms with the events of what occurred next. All I can remember is an air of unbelievable dread settling down over me like a weighted blanket, suffocating me. I tried to move my limbs, but I found I couldn't. The skittering noise came again, over and over again in my brain. A voice kept shrieking, "Do not move." My eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for some sort of logic to this madness. There's no way this was sleep paralysis. It had settled in way too fast. That's when I realized it wasn't sleep paralysis. This is what they meant when people say they were paralyzed in terror. More skittering. And then, a small dark figure crept out of the shadow in the corner of the room. It was small, but its limbs were gangly. Its hair was unkempt and unruly. The only feature I could clearly make out of the reflection of the red exit light in its eyes as they locked onto mine. Slowly, creakily, it crawled down the wall like a spider towards the ground. My lungs refused to take in any oxygen as its twiggy limbs jerked and cracked as it crawled towards me. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized it was crawling towards me, upside down. It crumbled in on itself as it came closer. The skittering noises coming from its now visibly gaping mouth. I wanted to scream, run, anything. But I was frozen in place, shivering and sobbing silently as it came to hover over me. Its forehead grazed my own, as its white pupilless eyes bore into mine. Creaking and popping, it began to stand, contorting around itself as it stood up to glower down at me. Looking up at it, it looked almost like a normal 6-year-old girl. The thing began to heave as though it were laughing hysterically, although no sound came from the gaping hole in its face. Every so often, its neck would crack as it craned from side to side. It wriggled its gangly fingers, snapping with each jerky movement. Then, it took a long, deep, creaky breath. It was a sound that I had never heard and would never hear again. I'm not sure when I blacked out. I awoke surrounded by paramedics and panicked camp administrators. My junior counselor recounted to me later that I was lying on my back on the floor, my mouth agape in a soundless shriek, and my eyes rolled back so far that they appeared glassy and white. Upon her trying to shake me awake, I fell into a violent seizure. Seeing as this was my first ever seizure, I was to be taken to the hospital, despite my protests. The administrators assured me that my kids would be fine, and that I could come back once I was given the all clear by the doctors. I was carted past a group of concerned campers, as they were all waiting outside to catch a peek at the action. I glanced over at them and I gave them all an enthusiastic thumbs up, promising I was fine, and I would be back soon. One wild-haired child caught my eye. Molly. She watched me silently, with a slack jaw, her mouth gaping too wide for her small face. Her eyes were pupilless and white. The girl's tiny shoulders slowly began to heave in pure silence as I was loaded into the ambulance. For a moment, it looked as though she was laughing. Hello again. I'd like to thank you all for liking and listening to my last video. It really does mean the world to me. I'm getting new equipment this weekend, and hopefully it's only getting better from here. Thank you all for subscribing. And remember, be scared. Be very scared.